Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of How Stories Work. Today, I want to go over the crucial element and what that means in a virtuous story. If we come into subtext and I come into the premise builder, you'll see the default premise here: abandon hiding one's true self, and you could obtain independence. The premise in subtext is a combination of one character element and one plot element. When you hear people say, oh, is it a character driven story or a plot driven story? The right answer is that both exist at the same time, and that the meaning of a story exists in the space between character and plot. The default arrangement has a character element of a void. So there are all these different versions of what a void would look like, mixed with an objective story plot element of obtaining, which is usually about achieving something. This works great for your typical Western American culture triumphant ending here, where everything ends in success for everybody, and that the overall judgment of what happened was a good thing. So when you combine success and good, you get a triumphant feeling, and that's why this premise has a very triumphant attitude to it. Abandon running away, and you can achieve something. So that is a triumphant message. And you'll see down here that in order to tell this story, you would have the main character in the beginning, someone who is running away, and then at the end, they change directions and head back the other way. So that's why when you see physical representations of this, literal representations, both in The Lion King and Mad Max Fury Road, where in one half of the film, they're going one direction, which is running away. And then in the second half of the film, they're going the other direction. And the way this works is by making sure that the main character is motivated by a void, that's their element, and that the character that challenges them with an alternate perspective, the influence character, is somebody who's coming from a place of pursuit. In Mad Max, that would be Furiosa. She's obviously motivated by pursuit. And then in Lion King, it's both his father and Rafiki who are motivating him by pursuit, and a little bit of Nala there when he meets her out far away from home. And the reason why you would want the main character motivated by a void when you're trying to argue for abandoning avoiding is because then when it comes time to solve the story, in order for it to end in success, you would want that main character to abandon his or her motivation of avoid and replace it with pursuit so that then it can turn out to be a success. And that's why you get a triumphant ending. That's the meaning of the story. Change in a virtuous story because the meaning of the story is going to be different. The premise will be different. And then therefore the structure of the story will be different. So if I flip this to virtuous, I'm just going to do it right here. Now you'll see that the premise changed. Virtuous are those who transform something by hiding one's true self. So now this is something that's very different. Instead of achieving something, now it's something that's more about transforming. So perhaps it could be manifesting someone's true self. A popular story with this kind of structure is one where the main character is always trying to avoid trouble or prevent something. And then they find out at the end that they've just been running away from themselves. And by giving that up, then they are able to manifest their true self. The meaning behind a virtuous story is one where the efforts to resolve the objective story plot are given up in exchange for a personal triumph. That's typically what it means to tell a story of virtue. You're giving up some outwardly external reward for something that's more internal. Now, most writers, when they switch to this ending of virtuous, they come down here, build the story, and don't think twice about it. But what happens is then when they go into their story and look at the structure, they're a little confused because now this arc has flipped. Now the main character is starting out with pursuing something, and by the end, they're avoiding something. And now it becomes very difficult to understand. Are they giving up the pursuit element, or are they giving up the avoid element? Let me explain to you the meaning of this premise here. The premise here is not attached to the main character specifically, and it's not attached to the objective story specifically. It's attached to the meaning of what it is that the author's trying to get across. And that's why up here, when you look at the motivating elements here, and you can choose specifically which one the main character is attached to, that's why you want to make sure that this is correct first before you even look into arcs or the rest of the story form or any of the extra added features like focus or direction. You're going to get very confused unless you first lock down which side of this argument the main character is on and which side of the argument the influence character is on. And the idea here in subtext is to keep you from having to go around and engage in all these mental gymnastics trying to figure out how it all fits together, and instead just focus in on what it is that you want to say. If you have decided that the main character is all about running away from something or avoiding something, and then the influence character is someone who is pursuing, and then you decide to change it to a story of virtue that you feel like this premise connects with you more, the main character is still attached to that avoid element, and the influence character is still attached to that pursuit element. You don't want to flip it because now you're changing what your story means, and you're just going to keep going back and forth. So the very first thing you want to do, and that's why it's listed here as the dramatic argument, is to decide which side the main character is on, which side the influence character is on, and then let the story dynamics and subtext determine the structure of the rest of the story, and then you will be able to make it fit into place. So what this means in this particular story is, yes, the main character will be somebody who is running away, or perhaps someone who is always running away from things. And the influence character is somebody who's going to be pursuing. And obviously the main character is going to be tied up into that too in the objective story. That's going to be creating a lot of problems. And that if the main character was just able to get their point across strongly enough, then the objective story would have ended in success. That would have been a completely different story. But because they essentially take this element and just keep it to themselves, perhaps they find that they're the ones that have been running away from their true self. They take it out of the mix of the objective story so that then the objective story is still stuck with this motivating element, this motivated problem, and that's why it ends in failure. If I look at the classic example of a story of virtue, Rain Man, this is very close to the example I was just giving. Virtuous are those who become nicer people by letting something go. The argument is between a motivation of free and a motivation of control. So the diametrically opposed motivations of being free of everything or living a life of control. On one end, we have Charlie Babbitt, who's completely living free from attachments. And he's the kind of hustler who would argue that his success comes from living free of those attachments. Just being able to do whatever you want to is success. Whereas Raymond's idea of success is something that's very rigid, something that's very controlled and directed, all his schedules and his strict routines. The two of these argue this back and forth in the story. Raymond doesn't necessarily come right out and say it, but the driving force of what is being said with these two characters is this argument between free and control. And that if Charlie had kept on doing this free and kept running away with Raymond, then he would always have control over Raymond. Charline continues this free up until the point where the guy actually offers to buy him out and give him the money that he wants. But at that point, Charlie's already decided that's not what he wants. He would rather live his life more directed and more controlled and closer to his brother. So he gives up that freedom element, which is what actually was the reason why that guy was going to give him the money at the end. He gives that up, and that's why it ends in failure. So the argument is, hey, it's much more virtuous when you can let something go to become a nicer person instead of creating all this frantic energy around you. You just bring that into yourself and you let go of those attachments that you had, all that stuff that he was holding on to about his father. You let that go, and then you will have some version of personal success. Another great example of this is American Beauty. American Beauty is another story of virtue. Virtue lies in those who get out of their way and give it to someone straight, even if it means realizing that one is dying. The argument here is an argument between actuality and perception. Lester, on one side, because he's going through this midlife crisis, is completely obsessed with the reality of the world around him. He can see through all the pretension, and he's always pointing it out, always giving it to everybody straight, except to himself. And then Ricky, on the other side, is someone who sees the beauty in everything as a means to protect himself from his father. He's seeing the beauty in something as grotesque as a piece of trash. This argument goes back and forth, and it would have gotten to the point where Lester would have ended up really manifesting the kind of life that he was trying to get across, which unfortunately was with a young teenage girl, until he finally saw the reality of it and realized, this is not me. This is not right what I'm doing. He finally saw the objective reality of what it was that he was working towards. And then he took that and put that into himself. And that's why he turned her down at the end. But unfortunately, because he took that out of the mix, then that's why Ricky's father went through with killing him. And that's why the argument here of the story is that the virtue lies in not seeing all the reality in everybody else, but seeing it in yourself, even if that means realizing at the end that you've reached the end of the line. And then the other one, which is a little more complicated, but equally as interesting, is Michael Clayton. Virtuous are those who stop living on the edge by getting out of their own way and revealing the truth. Now, the dramatic argument here is one between Michael Clayton here on the left and Arthur Eden on the right, the Tom Wilkinson character. Michael on the left is someone who's so much on the edge with all the debts that he has to pay that he tolerates working with corrupt people and allowing corrupt practices to continue. That's what it means to be motivated by accurate, that you're motivated to tolerate and do things that are within reason, even though perhaps they're not the most legit or right things to do. Whereas Arthur, who's been living this life forever and who's so distraught with defending corrupt corporations, argues that everything that they're doing is wrong and that it's not right to not speak out against what is wrong. This goes back and forth with Michael really arguing from a point of view of accurate, and then Arthur coming over here from a point of deviation. This would have ended in success. So the protagonist in this film is not Michael Clayton. Because of some complex narrative dynamics, Michael Clayton is actually the antagonist. The woman that is the counsel for You North, the Tilda Swinton character, she's actually trying to get this through and to buy off all the people that were hurt by their chemicals. She's the protagonist. If Michael had been able to continue that and he had just tolerated it long enough, Swinton would have been able to go through with it, which is why there's that weird sort of dynamic where he does the right thing at the end, but it's a failure because he's done the virtuous thing. He's decided to stop living on the edge and then to finally reveal the truth. So he takes that element of toleration and brings that into himself because he will no longer tolerate not living his truth. And that is why the story ends in failure. His brother and the cops come in, and that's the end of it. And then he can leave feeling good about what he had done, but there's still that bittersweet feeling to it. It's not like a complete triumph. And that's because of that dual balance between a failure and good ending or a virtuous ending. So that's it for how these stories work. If you have any question about how to combine character and plot and tell a story of virtue, please let me know. If not, I will see you tomorrow.